Welcome to tonight's lecture here at the Harry Ransom Center, which has been generously co-sponsored by the Department of English here at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you very much for coming out. So right now, English, yeah, you gotta think English. And I'm sure, and they would be mad at me if I didn't say that, so I have to make sure I do well with my colleagues. So right now you're hearing from me, Aaron Pratt, the Carl and Lily Forsheimer Curator of Early Books and Manuscripts here at the Ransom Center. If it's here and it's really old, from before 1700 or something, it's something I deal with. Currently, as many of you have seen, I have a small exhibition up in our Stories to Tell gallery called Understanding Chaucer. In fact, I did put this display together just so I could scheme to invite tonight's speaker to Austin, and I stole from her book when writing my labels. I actually cite you on one of the labels, though, to not be complete plagiarist. So do check it out if you haven't already, because the cast of characters that you're going to see in tonight's story are pretty well represented in those cases. So, Dr. Megan L. Cook is Assistant Professor of English at Colby College in Maine, where she teaches medieval literature with an emphasis on Chaucer and other late medieval poets. As you're about to learn, her own research focuses on the fate of Middle English texts and books in the early modern period, so the 16th and 17th centuries. Just this year, the University of Pennsylvania Press published her first book, The Poet and the Antiquaries, Chaucerian Scholarship and the Rise of Literary History, 1532 to 1635. And I've read the whole damn thing, and as a result, can truly say, and I do that for very few monographs, I read the whole damn thing, and I don't even work in that period, the whole damn thing, and as a result, can truly say, huge congrats are in order. And I believe that what you'll be hearing tonight comes from research that Megan did for this book, and so if you like it, buy the book. Okay, and also out this year, Megan's been busy, is an edition of John Lydgate's Dance of Death and Related Works that Megan co-edited with Elizaveta Strakov. It came out just in time for Halloween, if I'm remembering correctly. It's about dead things. It's both in print and freely available online through the Team's Middle English Text series. So you can get that sort of copy to put under your pillow to help you think good dreams or scary dreams, and you can read it online. The world of nerds who research 16th century English books is not a huge one, as much to my chagrin. And I believe that Megan and I first crossed paths online around 2010 or so in the early days of Rare Book Twitter, which is dear to my heart, but just look at it, it's great. And we really got to know each other, though, in the summer of 2012, when I was a grad student staff lackey on an NEH summer seminar that Megan participated in called Tutor Books and Readers, which had us together for over a month. This is in the days when the NEH was like, we'll fly you anywhere. Gone are those days. We were in Antwerp, London, and Oxford like a little over a month in total, I think. And so the upshot of that little anecdote is that at this point, it's been a little while since our friendship was forged on the crucible of bad karaoke in Belgium. And I think that we sang Green Day together? Yeah. So, karaoke memories are supposed to be fuzzy ones, and so I'll kind of leave it there. So with that, it's my great privilege, I think our great privilege, to welcome Megan L. Cook, who will be speaking with us tonight about the First Folio, editing Chaucer in Renaissance England. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron, for that generous introduction and those warm memories of that particular Belgian karaoke bar. Thank you, too, for inviting me to come down here. Thanks to the English department for co-sponsoring, and to Lisa Pulsiver and the rest of the staff at the Ransom Center who've made me feel so welcome. A part of the research for this project was actually undertaken while I was a short-term fellow here at the Ransom Center in, I believe, 2016. So it's nice to revisit the site of so much productive thinking on this topic. All right, let's begin. So if you are a person who thinks about early printed books or the history of the English literature, the phrase, the First Folio, probably brings to mind this book. Uh-oh. Oh, no. It is not on. It says it's on. Ah, there we go. Whoa. Printed in 1623, Mr. William Shakespeare's comedies, histories, and tragedies is heralded as, quote, the book that gave us Shakespeare, and remains so central to the playwright's enduring mythos that the Folger Shakespeare Library sent copies out to tour all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico in order to commemorate the 400th year anniversary of Shakespeare's death in 2016. Of course, there are 3 always right here at the Ransom Center. The enduring impact of the folio depends not only on its contents, which include the best available text of the majority of Shakespeare's plays, but also its form. When it was published by Isaac Jaggard and Edward Blount in 1623, it did more than gather together Shakespeare's plays into a single volume. It presented a particular version of the author and his works to the world, and with its large folio size, more commonly used for law books and Bibles, an engraved frontispiece depicting the deceased playwright, it staked a claim for the significance of its author in the English literary marketplace. The Shakespeare First Folio, however, was not the first folio. That distinction belongs to the works of Geoffrey Chaucer, first printed in 1532, 91 years before the Shakespeare First Folio. If the Shakespeare First Folio would be, in some sense, about establishing its author's authorship and canon, the Chaucer Folio is about all of that, plus about establishing the very tradition in which Shakespeare later claims a place. The stakes, in other words, are high, and the publication format is unprecedented. To put it plainly, the 1532 works of Geoffrey Chaucer mark the first attempt to bring together all the works of an English language author in a single, impressively large printed book. Clocking in at nearly 400 pages, the 1532 Chaucer and its successors are the largest volumes of poetry printed in 16th century England. Chaucer, who died in 1400, was of course a favorite of 15th century scribes as well, but no surviving manuscript come close to a complete collection of his writings. He was also a mainstay of English printing well before the publication of the works. But the books printed by William Caxton, Wynkyn de Worde, and other early printers were more modest in both size and scope than the folios that would follow. While earlier manuscripts and printed books like these continued to circulate in the 16th century and beyond, the large folio editions of the works produced in 1532 and thereafter were a bold bibliographic departure from their predecessors, and in time would come to outnumber those earlier publications. In my talk today, I'm going to take us on a brief tour of the 6 folio editions published between 1532 and 1602, beginning with William Thinn's 1532 edition. I'm going to argue that through their contents, their commentary, and their form, these folio editions make several interrelated claims. 1, that language, including poetic language, is fundamentally tied up with English identity. 2, that Chaucer is a privileged innovator in the history of the English language. And 3, because of 1 and 2, Chaucer needs to be studied and not just read, a fact that reflects, but is not entirely driven by, changes in the English language and the antiquarian interest in his work that resulted in things. I'm sorry, I'm gonna move away from the clicker because it's not working right. Reflected in features like this etymological glossary, framing these claims about how Chaucer was regarded is my larger argument, which is that the Chaucer folios matter not just as literary documents, but because they tell us a great deal about how people in the Renaissance thought about the English past and thought about themselves in relation to that past. The 16th century and the early 17th century produced some of the most celebrated reworkings of Chaucer's verse and stories, including Spenser's Faerie Queene and Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, both of which you see here. But Chaucer also pops up in writing that is not overtly about literature, such as John Fox's Protestant historiography, William Camden's Topographical History of the British Isles, John Stow's Annales, or the Catholic Anglo-Dutch antiquarian Richard Verstegen's Restitutions of a Decayed Intelligence. In other words, a lot of people cared about Chaucer a great deal for reasons that had very little to do with his poetry, and the folios reflect that. As such, in the next 40 minutes or so, we'll trace the development of Chaucer's printed works across successive folio editions. We'll look closely at the features of books that shaped the way that readers thought about Chaucer's place in English history. I'll discuss William Thinn's preface to the 1532 works, a woodblock frame, which you see up here, depicting the genealogies of the houses of York and Lancaster used in the 1561 works, and an intricate full-page engraving depicting Chaucer and his genealogy that was prepared especially for the 1598 works. Finally, we'll reflect on the special emphasis given to Chaucer's language in antiquarian commentary as Middle English grew ever more distant from more contemporary forms of English. All of these examples show how early printed editions presented Chaucer as an ideal figure through which post-Reformation readers could think about England's distance from and its enduring connection to its own medieval past. Part 1, printing Chaucer. So no matter your reason for reading Chaucer in early modern England in the Renaissance, if you wanted to read his poetry, odds are you would eventually need to get your hands on a copy of one of the Folio editions. As these collections transmitted Chaucer's writings to new and wider audiences, they also shaped readers' understanding of Chaucer and his text. Complex, involved books, each of the folios was produced by a well-established printer or printers working with an individual who had some kind of ties to the antiquarian community. And the three individuals that I'm going to focus on today were the courtier William Thynne, who is responsible for the first three editions on that slide, the antiquarian John Stow, who's associated with the 1561 edition, and the schoolteacher Thomas Speight, who's connected to the 1598 and 1602 editions. These men made decisions about which texts to include and which exemplars to use if and when multiple sources were available. They arranged the works within the volume. So since 1532, in every collected edition of Chaucer's works I've been able to lay my hands on, the Canterbury Tales is first, not Chaucer's first work. No sort of chronological logic to it, but there it is. And in some cases, these editors also bestowed on poems the titles by which they are still known today. There's an interesting story about the Book of the Duchess I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A if anyone wants to know more. At times, these antiquarians intervened in their text, amending and modernizing and choosing between variants. Their influence, along with that of the printers with whom they worked, extended to things like the choice of typeface, the design of title pages, and the addition of introductory and explanatory materials like dedications and later on glossaries. So, in content as well as in form, William Thynne's 1532 edition set the pattern for Chaucerian printing for the next 2 centuries. Drawing on printed books and on manuscripts, the 1532 Chaucer contains most of the canon as we know it today, including the first printed editions of a number of Chaucerian texts, including the Legend of Good Women, the Treatise on the Astrolabe, and Chaucer's translation of the Roman de la Rose. In addition, Thynne added, wittingly or otherwise, a number of non-Chaucerian works. Taken together, apocryphal texts account for nearly a quarter of the book's pages. And you can see here's a text that we hold to be canonical today and one that we don't, and they're treated in exactly the same way. The 1532 works were reprinted in 1542 and again in about 1550, although Thynne died in 1548. The chief textual difference between these editions and the 1532 works is the addition of a spurious ploughman's tale, an anti-Catholic satire to the Canterbury Tales. The Ploughman's Tale does not appear in any earlier printing of the tales, and it is not found in any of the 80-some surviving Canterbury Tales manuscripts, although it has been added in manuscript to a copy of the 1532 works that you can see out on display in the exhibition. And exactly where that text comes from is something of a mystery even today. In 1561, the works were printed again, this time under the aegis of the antiquarian John Stow. Stow's edition reproduced the text of the 1550 works with only minor alterations, but it added John Lydgate's Canterbury Tales fanfic, The Siege of Thebes, and a series of shorter poems at the end of the volume, most of which, like the Ploughman's Tale added by an earlier generation of editors, are now apocryphal. An important exception to this is Chaucer's words into Adam his own scrivain, where Chaucer sort of yells at his scribe for doing a bad job of copying his works. So it's a fan favorite. Although Stow's works appeared when he was in his mid-30s, he would return to Chaucer almost 40 years later, contributing materials to Chaucer's biography that appeared in Thomas Speight's edition of the works. And it is this edition that was printed in 1598, as I said, under the auspices of the schoolteacher Thomas Speight. Speight's edition was revised and reprinted in 1602, that's the middle image, and reprinted a third time in 1687. I'm not going to talk about the 1687 today. The 1598 edition reproduces Stow's 1561 texts and adds 2 previously unprinted and apocryphal poems. You can see these down at the bottom, The Assembly of Ladies and The Flower and the Leaf. These are also included in the 1602 revision, which adds 2 more works, this time both religious in nature. These are the ABC, Chaucer's previously unprinted translation of a French poem in praise of the Virgin Mary, and Jack Upland. Jack Upland is a proto-Protestant polemic, and it had been previously printed at least twice, once in the 1530s and once in the 1550s, so it was circulating under Chaucer's name. It was also included and attributed to Chaucer in John Fox's Acts and Monuments. And this is, I think, an important reminder of how Chaucer's reputation, especially as a kind of religious reformer, although we don't have evidence that says that this was how Chaucer really thought. He seems to have been a pretty conventional dude when it came to religion. But this particular vision of Chaucer as a reformer, as a proto-Protestant, as someone who anticipated the way that people in power in England might believe after the Reformation, that really had credence. In addition to these new texts, the Spade edition expanded upon previous iterations of the work by adding a significant amount of material designed to help readers better appreciate Chaucer and his writings. The material places a focus on explanation rather than simply praise of Chaucer and his writings. The new front matter included a dedication to Sir Robert Cecil and an address to the reader that explains some things about Chaucer's versification. It also included the prefatory material from the 1532 works, a substantial biography of Chaucer, and summaries of each of the Canterbury Tales. At the back of the volume, Spade includes translations for Chaucer's Latin and French phrases and a list of authors cited in the text, as well as a hard word list. And this is the first time we see a really significant glossary of Middle English prepared for later readers. And as you can see there, it's revised and expanded when the works are printed again in 1602. So in some ways, the Spade editions are the first to look forward to modern editions of Chaucer and other Middle English authors, in that they appear to assume that the readers will find Chaucer's poetry both linguistically challenging and historically distant. In other ways, however, an edition like Spade's is a culmination of the past century's engagement with Chaucer. Spade presents Chaucer as a medieval author who anticipates and enables the literary successes of later English poets, while also remaining exemplary of his own historical and literary moment. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by that later on in the talk. Although they appeared over a span of 7 decades, the Chaucer Folios share a number of features that demonstrate the importance of both historical and literary concerns in the production, marketing, and use of the Chaucer book. First of all, size. The sustained run of monumental folio editions from the 1530s onward is unique. No other English author's works were collected, printed, and reprinted on such a scale in the 16th century. The heft of those editions, and if you have seen the exhibit, you know what I'm talking about with that heft, helped lend Chaucer an authoritative, scholarly air, but at a cost, since folios are more expensive, less portable, and less suited to private individual reading than other smaller formats. Chaucer's 16th century print history is also remarkable for what it does not include, and that is editions of his individual works. While prior to 1532, editions of the Canterbury Tales, Troilus and Cressade, and shorter poems were issued with some regularity, after the appearance of Thynne's works, there was no further effort to reproduce those texts in more modest formats. The only individual works printed under Chaucer's name between 1532 and 1687 were the apocryphal tales I've already mentioned, The Ploughman's Tale and Jack Upland. Both of these were published as inexpensive pamphlets, clearly intended for readers who might be primarily interested in the text's hardcore proto-Protestant views rather than their associations with a medieval poet. In the folios, an additive tendency prevails. Stuff is added, but it's rarely taken away, and each new edition is based on the previous, with the 1542 printers using a copy of the 1532 works, and so on. This process means that Thynne's text, the one that he printed in 1532, remained the basis for all printed editions of Chaucer until Thomas Tyrwhitt's 1775 edition of the Canterbury Tales, almost a century and a half later. It also means, for example, that when the spurious anti-Catholic Ploughman's Tale was added to the tales in 1542, that too was reprinted in later editions until Tyrwhitt removed it on the grounds that it doesn't sound much like Chaucer and doesn't appear in any of the manuscripts. In sum, then, for good or for ill, decisions made in the preparation of these early works shaped Chaucer's text for many generations of readers, and the version of Chaucer that they received through these folios can sometimes look very different than the one that we study today. So that's my introductory part. Part 2, Chaucer's language and the language of Chaucerian praise. Now that we've got the big picture, I want to look at some specific examples that show how these folio editions made claims for Chaucer's significance that extended far beyond the literary or the poetic, even when talking about things like the excellence of Chaucer's language. For many commentators in the Renaissance, Chaucer's most noteworthy accomplishments were not his robust characters, his sophisticated engagements with classical and continental sources, or his experiments in meter, all things that we praise him for today. They were instead his words, which were seen to have single-handedly elevated English to the same level of richness and sophistication as the continental vernaculars. So Chaucer, in this sense, plays a role that's kind of analogous to what Shakespeare will play later on in the Anglophone world, a singular, proper name, also white and male, to which wide-ranging claims for linguistic innovation could be attached, right? So if you've ever looked at one of those lists of words invented by Shakespeare, basically in the Renaissance, they were looking at words invented by Chaucer. Chaucer's language had always been important to his poetic admirers, going back to his contemporaries John Gower and Thomas Hoccleve. But the collected folio editions of the work are newly and especially attuned to the extra literary implications of claims for Chaucer's eloquence. So the dedicatory preface to William Thinn's 1532 edition of Chaucer's collected works offers perhaps the most fully articulated account of this view. And here I should note that although it's written in 1532, it's printed in all of the other editions that follow from it. So this book, the 1532 edition, was very much the product of Henry VIII's court. Its compiler Thynne was the chief clerk of the kitchen. His collaborator Brian Tuck was the treasurer of the chamber. I believe, as far as I've been able to work out, they sort of had offices across the hall from one another in Hampton Court. And Thomas Godfrey, who printed it, was the recipient of the first royal patent for printing a book in England. So it's not surprising then that the book is dedicated to Henry, and that it's equipped with a fulsome preface that underscores Chaucer's potential usefulness to early modern projects of nation building, while also emphasizing the importance of learning and wisdom to good government. For Thynne, eloquence goes hand in hand with learning and other forms of cultural distinction, and by printing Chaucer, he's contributing to a broader project of English excellence, right? The implication being here that Henry should give him money. In a long discussion of continental vernaculars and their relationship to Greek and Latin, Thynne emphasizes that the achievement of eloquence is not an accidental or organic process, but requires intentional effort, diligence, on the part of a language's speakers. In Thynne's account, Geoffrey Chaucer is chief among those who have worked for the betterment of the English language. While Thynne's comments on Chaucer address his style as well as his works, it is clear that for Thynne the significance lies not in Chaucer's poetry itself, but in what his verses demonstrate about the excellence and capability of English in both the linguistic and national sense of the term. This, and I apologize in advance, there are 3 slides with a lot of text on them. That's it. Once we get through this, they're gone. So Thynne praises Chaucer as someone, quote, in whose works is so manifest comparabation of his excellent learning, in all kinds of doctrines and sciences, such fruitfulness of words, well according to the matter and purpose, so sweet and pleasant sentences, such perfection in meter, the composition so adapted, such freshness of invention, compendious in narration, such sensible and open style, lacking neither majesty nor mediocrity, convenable in disposition, and such sharpness or quickness in conclusion. Here, Thynne presents Chaucer as a master of literary values he assumes his 16th century audience will share. However, as the epistle continues, it becomes clear that Chaucer's works matter most of all as the evidence of the beautifying and bettering of the English tongue during a time that Thynne holds to have been generally inhospitable to such efforts. This is what makes Chaucer such not just a good poet, but an extraordinary one. As Thynne puts it, It is much to be marveled how in his time, when doubtless all good letters were laid asleep throughout the world, as the thing which either by the disposition and influence of the bodies above or by the ordinance of God seemed like as was in danger to have utterly perished, such an excellent poet in our tongue should, as it were, nature repugning, spring and arise. So from a grammatical perspective, and I've thought about this text for a long time, from a grammatical perspective, it's not entirely clear here what the thing is that's in danger of perishing without Chaucer's aid, but what is certain is that Chaucer's poetic achievements transcend their historical moment, making them temporally as well as literarily exceptional. Chaucer is presented here as a figure not just untimely, but almost unnatural, springing forth despite nature repugning. As the preface continues, an air of untimeliness clings to Chaucer, whose works, quote, seemeth for the admiration, novelty, and strangeness that it might be reputed to be of in the time of the author in comparison as pure and fine, a precious or polished jewel out of a rude or indigest mass or matter. Rather than emerging from the indigested mass of late medieval England, Finn further suggests Chaucer belongs more properly to either the Greek or Roman past or the Henrician present. Thus he continues, for though it had been in Demosthenes or Homerus' times, when all learning and excellency of sciences flourished among the Greeks, or in the season that Cicero, prince of eloquence amongst Latins, lived, yet it had been a thing right rare and strange, and worthy perpetual laud, that any clerk by learning or wit could that have framed a tongue before so rude and imperfect to such a sweet ornature and composition. Likely if he had lived in these days, being good letters so restored and revived as they be, if he were not impeached by the envy of such as may tolerate nothing, which to understand their capacity does not extend, to have brought it unto a full and final perfection. So in this passage, Finn articulates a view of Chaucer that will be echoed in the works of later writers like Sir Philip Sidney. On the one hand, for Finn, Chaucer is out of sync with his own age, as his accomplishments occurred during a period where all good letters were laid asleep throughout the world. On the other hand, Chaucer is an exemplar of classical eloquence, and thus is on par with the Henrician present, in which those good letters are so restored and revived as to make a full and final perfection of language possible. Chaucer's writings are presented here as both a continuation of classical learnedness and as something that might draw the envy of a lesser sort of contemporary reader, in short, as though he were still a living author. While Thomas Wilson might have had poetry in mind when he complained in his 1553 Art of Rhetoric that, quote, the fine courtier will talk of nothing but Chaucer, Finn's preface suggests a variety of reasons why the English courtier, eager to demonstrate both loyalty and eloquence in the rapidly shifting environs of the Henrician court, might have found Chaucer, in particularly, a useful focal point for courtly discourse. Moving on, part 3, reframing Chaucer. So Finn's preface, as we've seen, did much to link Chaucer with the development of the English language and through it, Englishness itself. The 1561 edition vividly shows how bibliographic features like title pages could convey specific ideas about how and why Chaucer mattered in 16th century England. The title pages to the 3 Finn editions use architectural borders, but John Stowe's edition of the works introduces a new title page, which you see here, that features the Chaucer family coat of arms, thereby emphasizing Chaucer's courtly status, and on several interior title pages makes use of the extraordinary Tree of Jesse woodcut frame originally produced for Edward Hall's union of the 2 noble and illustrious families of Lancaster and York, better known as Hall's Chronicle. So the bottom corners of this frame depict the slumbering figures of John of Gaunt and Edmund of York, from whose torsos emerge rose bushes blooming with the visages of 15th century royalty. At the top of the frame, the 2 bushes join as Henry VII extends a hand from his bloom to greet his Queen Elizabeth in hers, and above, in a double Tudor rose, Henry VIII presides over the entire scene. In the 1561 works, where the woodcut prefaces the Canterbury Tales and the Romance of the Rose, it quite literally provides a historical frame for Chaucer's text. The juxtaposition is striking. While the image quite clearly reflects the contents of Hall's chronicle, there is no self-evident link between the Canterbury Tales and the War of the Roses. Instead, the woodcut invites the readers to make the link between Chaucer, the historical figure, and the luminaries depicted in the woodcut. The Hall woodcut provides a visual manifestation of what had, by the middle of the 16th century, become an increasingly historicized and politicized frame of reference for reading Chaucer. The woodcut's biographical connection to Chaucer is via Chaucer's patron and brother-in-law, John of Gaunt, who you can see down in the bottom left. Used in the works, it suggests that whoever was responsible for its placement was aware of this connection between Chaucer and Gaunt and wanted to emphasize it. Joseph Dane and Seth Lair have argued, convincingly I think, that Stowe himself was involved in the production of the works, perhaps even present in the printing house. The antiquarian certainly had the necessary historical background to recognize this connection between Gaunt and Chaucer, and he must have known Hall's chronicle as a source for his own work. So I think it's very likely that John Stowe himself wanted this woodcut frame used in his edition of Chaucer. The use of the Hall woodcut in 1561 anticipates the more explicitly antiquarian orientation of the 1598 and 1602 Spate editions, which actively connect Chaucer's writings to his historical circumstances. The frontispiece of the 1598 works enumerates some of the features and aids for potential readers and buyers, and I'll just read these. 1, his portraiture and progeny showed. 2, his life collected. 3, arguments to every book gathered. 4, old and obscure words explaned. 5, authors by him cited, declared. 6, difficulties opened. I wrote a book on this book, and I still don't know what he means when he says difficulties opened. And 2 books before of his, never before printed. We talked about those a minute ago. Notably, neither this list nor the text of the title page as a whole mentions any of Chaucer's works by title. Chaucer's own name is the selling point here. The frontispiece for the revised edition, which was printed just 4 years later in 1602, has a similar appearance and emphasis. Readers are advised that they will find, quote, to that which was done in the former impressions, much is now added, including 1, in the life of Chaucer, many things inserted. This is true. 2, the whole work by old copies reformed. This is not true. 3, sentences and proverbs noted. 4, the signification of old and obscure words proved. Also, characters showing from what tongue or dialect they be derived. 5, the Latin and French, not English by Chaucer, translated. And 6, the treatise called Jacques Upland against friars, and Chaucer's ABC called La Prière de Notre Dame, at this impression added. Taken together, these 2 lists offer would-be buyers and readers a number of reasons why they might turn to this particular edition of Chaucer. Some of the aids listed here, such as the translation of Latin and French phrases and the glossary of old and obscure terms, could potentially help any reader. But taken together, these title pages present our most learned and ancient English poet, as they call Chaucer, as a figure of biographical and genealogical interest, a source of proverbial wisdom, and as a multilingual and intertextual writer. These themes are already present in the 1532 Thin Preface, but here it is clear that in assuming these roles, Chaucer has been made into an object of scholarly labor. Arguments are gathered, words are explained, and difficulties are opened, even if on close examination, the assertion that the whole work is by old copies reformed proves to be somewhat predictably overstated. Spate's editions make especially visible the hybrid status that Chaucer acquired over the course of the 16th century. On the one hand, a poet whose works are witty and wise, and who can be read for pleasure or edification. On the other, a figure from the increasingly distant English past. He has become someone whose life and works require explanation and interpretation so that later readers can fully understand the importance of his contributions to English literature and English identity. Chaucer's works remain a book to be read, but they are also increasingly presented as texts requiring study and careful explication. A striking full-page engraving prepared for the 1598 edition of the works visually and vividly demonstrates this dual approach to Chaucer. The artist, the historian and cartographer John Speed, was best known for his theater of the Empire of Great Britain and for the genealogical tables he contributed to the King James Version of the Bible. Speed's engraving is significant in that it marks the first time a formal author portrait appeared in a printed edition of Chaucer's writings. Early editions of the Canterbury Tales do show the poet on horseback. But it adds to this portrait a number of features that reflect Chaucer's status as an object of antiquarian fascination. In form and in content, the engraving exemplifies the two distinct, though interrelated ways of thinking about Chaucer that predominated at the close of the 16th century. One literary and laudatory, the other primarily historical. At the center of this image is a large full-length portrait of Chaucer, modeled on that found in manuscripts of Thomas Hoccleve's Regiment of Princes. The caption underneath identifies it as, quote, the true portraiture of Geoffrey Chaucer, the famous English poet, as by Thomas Hoccleve is described, who lived in his time and was his scholar, touting the picture as an authoritative and authorized image of the poet grounded in firsthand experience. Directly below, and that's what you see down here, Speed depicts the double tomb of Chaucer's son Thomas and daughter-in-law Maud, shown in situ at the Ewelme Parish Church. Notably, Speed has chosen not to show Chaucer's own relatively modest tomb in Westminster Abbey. The tomb chest features some 24 shields representing not only Thomas and Maud's direct ancestry, but the impressive number of baronial families to which the couple, though not Geoffrey Chaucer himself, was related by blood or marriage. So the connections are mostly through Thomas's wife's Maud, her side of the family, or Philippa Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer's wife, who was the sister of Catherine Swynford, who later became the wife of John of Gaunt. Speed has a distorted perspective here so that he can show three sides of the tomb and maximize the number of shields displayed. These include the arms of John of Gaunt and Edward, Duke of York, two key figures who you might remember from the woodcut from Hall's Chronicle that was used in the 1561 works. While the tomb occupies the space below the central portrait, an extensive genealogical diagram bristling with heraldic detail fills the space above and to the sides. These elements speak to the new significance that Chaucer and his writings had taken on as objects of historic and antiquarian study by the turn of the 17th century, and coupled with a more conventional author portrait at the center, they exemplify the dualism central to Chaucer's status in this period. This dualism also plays out in the ways that the engraving depicts Chaucer's relation to his progeny. At the center, the Hocclevian portrait recalls the poetic pedigrees and praise for Father Chaucer, familiar to scholars of 15th century literature. It collapses historical distance and invites viewers to come face to face with the author. As in religious devotional images, the viewer is visually cued to the fact that the encounter is a mediated one. Here, you look across the surface of the tomb, just as in an illumination from a Book of Hours, right? It's often framed as a window or a similar kind of arch or casement. The material that surrounds the portrait, by contrast, situates Chaucer in a specific historical moment and represents his historical existence as part of a genealogy that is not at all dependent on his poetic accomplishments. Although the heading at the top of the frame reads the progeny of Geoffrey Chaucer, it is Chaucer's father-in-law, Pan Rowett, Knight, who sits atop the family tree. Pan de Rowett, or Rowett, was a knight from the Low Countries who came to England in the service of Edward III, and who was father not only to Chaucer's wife Philippa, who, and this still bothers me, is identified here merely as the daughter of Pan Rowett, but also the father to Catherine Swynford, the mistress and, as I mentioned, later wife of John of Gaunt. As the left side of Spade's engraving illustrates, through this family connection, Chaucer can be linked to major figures in 15th century history, including both Henry IV and Henry V. The right-hand margin shows Chaucer's line of descent via his son Thomas, who was a successful politician in his own right. Thomas Chaucer's only child, Alice, acquired prodigious amounts of wealth and power through a series of impressive marriages. The third and the last, to William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, resulted in a son, John. John was the father of Edmund de la Pole, the Yorkist pretender of the throne, executed by Henry VIII in 1513. So what is going on here, basically, is that Spade thus links Chaucer to the houses of both Lancaster and York, and through them to networks of power and institutions that shaped the world in which Spede's audience lived and read. This is not a poetic tribute, rather, this is a history lesson. Taken as a whole, Spede's engraving brings together praise of Chaucer as a posthumous but sanctified literary figure, with a sense that he is, as Helen Cooper writes, embedded in the great tradition of the nation, in part by his close incorporation into the royal and aristocratic history of England. Importantly, this connection is not limited to Chaucer's own lifetime, nor does it only look backward to the classical inheritance. Instead, as the genealogies remind us, Chaucer's legacy extends directly to the 16th century, which will see, quote Helen Cooper again, the comparison of him to the great classical authors in the works, the patronage of Henry VIII, the tussle to claim him for each religion, the triumph of his misidentification as a forerunner of English Protestantism, and the erection of his tomb close to those of England's monarchs. All these various claims for Chaucer's lasting import find support in this genealogical framework. At each of its many levels, then, the Spede engraving offers a visual example of the representational choices consistently made when presenting Chaucer to early modern audiences. These choices, both in the engravings and the larger context of the work and related commentary, maximize Chaucer's status and importance not just to literary history, but to English nationalism in a much broader sense. All right, this is the last part. Although antiquarian readers like Finn, Stowe, and Spate made up only a small part of Chaucer's early modern readership, they played a disproportionately significant role in defining the medieval poet's reputation and constructing his canon. As a result of their work with medieval materials, antiquarians were probably among the best equipped readers of Chaucer's Middle English in early modern England. The average reader of the works and other printed copies of Middle English verse must have lacked the linguistic facility of an aficionado like John Stowe, but the assumption still seems to have been that since she or he could read, admire, or seems to have been that this reader could read, admire, and appreciate the language of earlier poetry. Indeed, the increasingly palpable antiquity of Middle English could even be a selling point. This attitude is not limited to Chaucer. Similar comments appear in the prefaces of 16th century editions of writers like Gower, Lydgate, and Langland. In each of the cases that I'm thinking of here, and I can talk more about these, the commentator acknowledges the difficulty or historical distance of the text he introduces, but also articulates a confidence that the 16th century reader will be able to navigate the intricacies of Middle English verse. This combined sense of connection and distance is on display throughout Spate's editions of Chaucer, both of which, as I've mentioned, are titled the works of our ancient and learned English poet, Geoffrey Chaucer. This title is worth dwelling on a little bit. It marks Chaucer as a specifically English poet, but he is also, for the first time, ancient. Taken together, ancient, learned, and English suggest a native author as sophisticated and rich as Latin and Greek classics. And of course, this was already anticipated in the way that Finn is talking about Chaucer in 1532. This dynamic finds lexicographical expression in the form of the glossary. Glossaries, like the genealogies in the Spede engraving, provide a path linking an archaic term, or ancestor, with its contemporary equivalent, or descendant. This connection is, importantly, never quite immediate, and access to the figure of Chaucer is never unmediated here. In Spede's engraving, readers must navigate 5 generations to move from Geoffrey Chaucer to Edmund de la Pole. In a glossary like Spate's, readers must move between Middle English terms and their definitions, linguistic difference functioning here as a marker of historical distance. With their language marked as both historically distant and foundationally English, Chaucer's writings thus become the first English classics. Far from bracketing off Chaucer as an antiquarian curiosity, irrelevant to current experiments in form and diction, marking Chaucer's language as distinct from contemporary usage might well have helped to assure his relevance to the major conversations about language, influence, and national identity that swirled in early modern England. As Lucy Monroe demonstrates, the 16th century witnessed a sustained poetic engagement with the idea of archaism in ways that both drew upon and helped to shape antiquarian practice. archaism, which like antiquarianism was in its early modern form deeply concerned with questions of national identity and secondarily with England's relation to its own past, made Chaucer's distant language newly available for poetic appropriation, perhaps most notably in the writings of Edmund Spenser. The perceived outdatedness of Chaucer's language, the idea it was now, as George Putnam wrote in his Art of English Poetry, no longer with us, was precisely what allowed him to serve as Spenser's well of English undefiled, and to appear as a writer who was, in the words of Spate's title page, both ancient and English. These examples show how, as the 16th century progressed, Chaucer became a site for the commingling of a tradition of readerly enjoyment and a new sense that the English past was worth studying in rigorous ways. This is true of other late medieval authors as well, of course, but the sustained attention given to Chaucer's archaism is unique and testifies to Chaucer's exceptional place as a figure primed to index both connection to and distance from the medieval past. Marked by language that was both recognizably English and increasingly seen as historically distant, Chaucer was at once an object of antiquarian attention and a familiar writer whose works remained accessible to many readers. The Folios demonstrate Chaucer's especially vaunted position in poetic genealogies from the 15th century onward, made both the author and his language a privileged site for the contemplation of the past in early modern England. As a writer whose language was identifiably English and whose achievements could be favorably compared with both later writers and classical ones, Chaucer represented both continuity and historical progression. At the same time, because his language was an earlier form of the vernacular, and because the historical and cultural moment in which he lived was increasingly thought of as other to the post-Reformation present, he also signaled the presence of chronological rupture within English history. This doubleness, I think, is key to Chaucer's special status in early modern England and the basis for his ability to signify meaningfully in both literary and historical context, an ability that is increasingly foregrounded in the marketing and presentation of successive editions of his works. In their shared concern for Chaucer's poetic legacy and the English past, the work of early antiquarians constitutes the pre-philological beginnings of what we today recognize as English literary history. The Chaucer Folios I've spoken about today are central to this conversation and show the works of the medieval poet poised at a permeable boundary between text for reading and text for studying. What one reader considers a text for serious scholarly examination in one context might also have been read for literary pleasure or moral insight in another, and the Folios are careful to sustain both kinds of readings. More generally, the repeated editions of Chaucer's works demonstrate that there was a market for large volumes of an English writer's works as early as the 1530s. The Chaucer Folios established Chaucer's canon, solidify his status as an author, and on their frontispieces, in their dedications, and in explanatory aids like glossaries, work hard to locate him in his historical context. These folios set the standard for Chaucerian publishing for more than 2 centuries, and were the versions of Chaucer known to Spenser, Shakespeare, Milton, Blake, Dryden. In these first folios, we might find an unfamiliar version of Chaucer, but we also see the beginnings of literary history as we know it today. Thank you.